Today, we're tackling something really central to how any team or company works. It's culture,
Exactly. And to get under the skin of it, we're diving into a conversation you shared with Natasha Noman. She's from Freche Freunde.
which means cheeky friends in English, right? The German food development company.
That's the one. And this audio recording we have, it's Natasha really laying out their, well, very intentional way of building culture.
So that's our source material. And our mission today for you listening is really to unpack the most insightful bits from that chat.
We want to get into how Freche Freunde actually defines culture, how they consciously shaped it, pretty much from day one.
And look at the actual systems they use, but also, maybe more crucially, the mindsets they've tried to cultivate.
Yeah, the goal is to give you some hopefully actionable ideas, maybe just a fresh angle on thinking about the cultures you work in or lead.
Okay, let's jump in. Natasha starts off by defining what culture means to them. How does she put it?
Well, for her, it basically boils down to how people interact and how they work together. Simple as that, really. And she sees it as being deeply rooted in the company's values.
Values are key, them.
Definitely. She emphasizes that. And it's clear culture isn't just, an HR thing on the side for them.
Right. Natasha mentions she spends a lot of her own time working on it. That says something.
It really does. And one of her first big points is that culture isn't something you just switch on when you decide to write stuff down.
It's there from the start.
Absolutely. Even when it was just her and her co-founder, the way they interacted,
Yeah.
that was the culture already forming, those unspoken rules.
Makes sense. The initial vibe sets the tone, but then as they grew, they needed something more formal.
Yeah, exactly. As the team got bigger, they realized they needed, systems. Systems to bring new people in the right way, keep the good people they had, and just make sure everyone was on the same page about how to interact.
Right, you can't rely on just knowing everyone anymore.
Precisely. So their first step towards formalizing things was trying to define their values.
Okay, standard enough first step. But it wasn't totally smooth sailing.
No, not quite. They initially came up with a list of 8 values, and Natasha herself admits that was just too many.
8? Yeah, I can see how that might be hard to, remember day to day.
Totally. They got diluted. And honestly, beyond the management team, not many people really grasped them or felt connected to them.
Okay, so how did they fix that? You said this part was interesting.
Yeah, this is cool. They basically scrapped the top-down list and went bottom-up. They ran workshops with every single person on the team.
Every single one.
Yep. And the focus was, what do you actually appreciate here? What do you strive for when you come to work? Much more grounded.
That sounds way more effective. Getting buy-in from the start. So what came out of those workshops?
They landed on a core set of values that genuinely reflected what the team felt. But, and this is key, they didn't stop there. For each value, they developed these things called Handlungsmaximen.
Handlungsmaximen. Action maxims, you said. Unpack that for us.
Think of them as practical guidelines, like internal rules for how you live that value. So for trust and respect, it wasn't just the words. They actually defined, what does trusting behavior look like here? What does respectful interaction mean in our meetings, in our emails?
Okay. So it makes the abstract value really concrete. Like, here's what you actually do.
Exactly. Super practical. But Natasha is also clear that culture is more than just the written stuff, the values and maxims.
Right. She mentioned mindset.
Yes, the mindset element, which she admits is trickier, harder to grasp, but absolutely fundamental. It's the underlying beliefs, the attitudes that drive how people show up.
And how do they try and cultivate that if it's so elusive?
Well, it's woven into a few key areas, onboarding, for instance. They have explicit conversations about the kind of mindsets they encourage.
So right from the start.
Right from the start. And it's also a big part of recruitment. They're actively looking for candidates who seem to have these mindsets, not just the right CV.
What kind of mindsets are we talking about? Any examples?
She gave a few, like valuing a growth mindset over a fixed mindset, that belief you can always learn and develop.
Okay.
Also, strength-oriented leadership, focusing on what people are good at. And a really core one, just believing that people fundamentally want to do good work and contribute positively. Plus, being open to different viewpoints.
That's a very positive foundation, assuming good intent.
It is. But she's also realistic. She knows people are at different stages with this stuff. Not everyone walks in with a perfect growth mindset.
True.
So they really value continuous growth and mindset. They try to create the space and the opportunities for people to actually develop these ways of thinking. It's an ongoing thing.
Which leads nicely into this idea she mentioned of a cultural operating system. What's that about?
Yeah, she uses that golden circle idea, the why, how, what.
Salmon Sinek. Right.
Exactly. So for Freche Freunde, the why is their purpose and their culture. That's the core. The how is the mindset they want people to have. And the what's the practical stuff. Structure, processes, tools.
Okay.
And her point is crucial.
Mm.
The structures and tools, they just won't work properly if the why, culture, and the how mindset aren't solid underneath.
So the system supports the culture, not the other way around.
Precisely. And she gave examples, like their self-management structure.
Mm.
No strict hierarchy.
Right.
That structure inherently requires and fosters responsibility, trust, flexibility, which are all core values for them. You have to trust people if there isn't a manager breathing down their neck.
Yeah, it forces the issue in a good way.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Any other structural examples?
The whole approach to roles is interesting. They encourage people to lean into their strengths rather than having rigid job descriptions.
So less about boxes on an org chart.
Much less. Someone creative might contribute to product ideas, not just marketing. It's about using talent wherever it fits. And they have processes for growth too, personal development plans, talks, that kind of thing.
But she had a caveat, didn't she, about just having the tools?
Oh, absolutely. A big one. She stressed that having the fanciest tools or the coolest processes doesn't magically create culture. The desire has to be there.
The desire from the people themselves.
Yes. People need to actually want to grow, to engage, to develop. You can lead a horse to water, basically. The tools support the willing. They don't create the willingness.
Got it. Okay, let's talk leadership then. Natasha's view seemed quite distinct from, well, traditional corporate ideas.
Very distinct. For her, leadership is fundamentally about empowerment, helping people reach their highest potential.
And she's quite critical of traditional structures.
She is. She feels that typical hierarchies, with their focus on, bonuses, promotions, extrinsic motivators, often end up killing creativity and that internal drive.
The intrinsic motivation.
Exactly. She's a huge believer in that. When people are driven by passion, by loving the work itself, that's when you get incredible results. She used the analogy of climbing Mount Everest.
Ah, right. People don't do that for a bonus check.
Precisely. They do it for the internal challenge, the achievement. That's the kind of motivation she wants to unlock at work.
So empowerment is about giving people the keys to unlock that motivation themselves. How does that look practically?
It means giving people autonomy, the resources they need, and trusting them to do great work. But she acknowledges it takes work.
Work because?
Because our education systems, often our past work experiences, tend to train us to wait for instructions, to fit into hierarchies.
Right. Unlearning old habits.
Exactly. So empowerment involves actively building people's confidence, showing them what they're capable of, removing those fears that hold them back from taking ownership.
And she connects this to the pace of change today.
Yeah, she argues that in a fast-moving world, you need the people closest to the problems, the pain points, to be empowered to make decisions quickly. You can't wait for things to go up and down a chain of command.
Makes sense for agility. Now, structurally, you mentioned self-management. They aren't strictly holacracy, though.
No, not strictly. They were inspired by it, they borrowed bits, but they emphasize adaptability above all.
Meaning?
Meaning, even the structural rules they do have can be challenged and changed if they aren't working for Freche Freunde's specific needs. They've kind of evolved their own hybrid system over time.
So they didn't just take holacracy off the shelf. Why did they deviate? Any specific reasons?
She mentioned long-term planning as one example. As a food development company, sometimes they need strategic alignment across teams that might span several years.
Okay.
And they felt a super strict interpretation of holacracy might make that kind of longer-term company-wide goal alignment a bit tricky.
So pragmatic. Take what works, adapt the rest. What serves as their foundation then, if not a formal holacracy constitution?
It comes back to the values.
Yeah.
Those collaboratively defined values. With their action maxims, the Hanlon's Maximin.
Ah, okay.
Those are the core principles. Trust and respect, responsibility, learning and growing, flexibility, Wirkung, which means impact, and proactivity. That's their bedrock.
You can really see how it all links together, the values, the mindset, the structure. But living these values requires skills, right? How do they build those?
Through training and development. It starts right in onboarding, but it's continuous. They have ongoing workshops throughout the year.
Integrated into company events.
Often, yeah. They have quarterly events that are heavily focused on culture, and the workshop topics cover a real range.
Like what?
Things like nonviolent communication, strength-oriented leadership again, time management, how to give and receive feedback effectively, conflict management, really practical skills for working well together in their system.
Sounds comprehensive. And Natasha's role is key here.
Yes, she mentioned seeing it as part of her job to kind of sense what the team needs next and organize the right workshops or support.
Beyond workshops.
They build reflection into meetings using check-ins, and they have specific meetings, individual and group, just to talk about how self-management is going, what needs tweaking.
And feedback. You said it wasn't top-down.
Right. It's encouraged from everywhere. Peers, anyone really. They have development supporters who often help facilitate that process. It's meant to be multi-directional.
Okay. What about when people don't quite live the culture? They must have thought about why that happens.
Definitely. Natasha's take is that it's usually not about bad intentions or lack of ability. More often, it stems from insecurity, fear of taking a risk, maybe.
Ah, okay, so the response isn't punitive.
Generally, no. The focus is on feedback, on setting personal development goals to help that person grow. Of course, she admitted, the very rare cases where someone fundamentally just doesn't align with the values, those are tough.
Understandable. So with all this focus on culture, recruitment must be critical.
Hugely critical.
Yeah.
They explicitly weigh cultural fit just as heavily as skills and experience.
How do they assess that?
They have multiple interview stages, one for skills, one for experience, but then a separate dedicated interview just focused on values alignment.
A whole interview just for values?
Yep. Because they've learned the hard way, she implied, that a bad cultural fit is much harder and ultimately more costly to fix than someone needing to learn a new technical skill.
That's a really strong statement. Makes sense, though. What about keeping people retention?
Part of that seems to be their salary model. They developed it internally, collaboratively.
Collaboratively, how does that work?
There's a review committee elected by the team members themselves that oversees it. They look at market rates, the level of responsibility someone has, and external factors like inflation, trying to keep it fair and transparent.
Wow. Elected team members reviewing salaries. That builds trust.
You'd imagine so. Transparency seems key there.
Now, Natasha is originally from France, working in Germany. Does she offer any thoughts on the German context specifically?
She did offer a few reflections. She observed that maybe historically focusing intensely on company culture wasn't always the top priority for some German companies.
But that's changing.
She definitely sees a shift happening now. Companies realizing they need to adapt, partly for the newer generations coming into work, partly just because the market demands more agility.
Are there hurdles to that shift, though?
She pointed to a couple of things. Maybe some persistent old-school leadership styles, and also reward structures in some places that are very focused on short-term results.
Which makes investing in long-term culture building harder.
Exactly, because building great culture is an investment. It doesn't always show up positively on the next quarterly report. So it can conflict with that short-term profit focus sometimes.
A really interesting tension to consider. Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive into Freche Freunde's culture, what are the big takeaways for you?
For me, it's seeing culture not just as a list of values, but as this living, breathing system. It's the interplay between the values, the mindset, and the structures that support them. And it needs constant attention, constant adaptation.
Involvement from everyone.
Absolutely. Freche Freunde really shows the power of involving the whole team, empowering individuals, and genuinely be prioritizing that long-term cultural health.
So for everyone listening, maybe the question is, how does this approach resonate? Thinking about defining values collaboratively, fostering that growth mindset, really empowering people, what bits could you maybe try or explore in your own world?
Which brings us to maybe a final thought to leave people with. If culture really is the fundamental operating system of a company, well, how much deliberate effort, how much ongoing care does it actually need to run well?
And maybe what's the hidden cost of not putting in that effort, of just letting the operating system get buggy or outdated? Something to think about.